Imagine the crowded streets of Rome. The year is 67 AD. Emperor Nero stands before the people, dressed in magnificent garments adorned with gold. Beside him is a young, dazzling woman. The Roman public looks on in admiration, but they also whisper, "This woman? She's actually a man." And so begins one of history's most bizarre and tragic stories. Because the person walking beside Nero was actually a young man named Sporus, and his entire life was torn apart for the sake of an emperor's obsessive desires. Nero was only 17 years old when he ascended to the imperial throne. In his early years, the people loved him. His interest in art, the festivals, and the games he offered the public seemed to herald a new era in Rome. But for the young emperor, power quickly turned into an addiction. The Roman throne was not just a center of governance, but also a hub of wild passions and limitless ambition. And Nero succumbed to those ambitions. One of the most influential figures in Nero's life was Poppaea Sabina, a woman legendary for her beauty. Poppaea Sabina, one of Rome's most talked about women. When her name came up, the first thing people thought of was her beauty. But this beauty wasn't just skin deep. Poppaea was a woman who, with her intelligence and charm, had captivated the most powerful men of her time. She was born in Rome in 30 AD. She came from a noble family. Both her mother and grandmother were powerful women, and Poppaea inherited both grace and political cunning from a young age. Even in her youth, she was known around the palace as a dazzling star. Her skin was incredibly pale, her hair a golden blonde. According to legend, she had her skin massaged with rare oils every day and spent hours in baths to preserve her beauty. Pliny even wrote that she washed her face with fresh donkey milk every day to keep her skin youthful. This detail alone had become a legend among the Roman people. But Poppaea was more than just a beautiful woman. She was also noted for her intellect. Her first marriage was to Rubrius Crispinus, a commander of the Praetorian Guard. She then married Otho, yes, the same Otho who would one day become Roman emperor. But Poppaea had her sights set higher. She wanted to reach the person who held the true power of Rome, Emperor Nero. Poppaea's influence over Nero was swift. Unable to resist her charm, the emperor quickly grew distant from his wife, Octavia. The public loved Octavia, finding her innocent and noble. But Nero had surrendered to Poppaea's allure. Poppaea influenced Nero not just with her beauty, but with her words. Historians write that she provoked and manipulated Nero, often feeding his darker side. For instance, to discredit Octavia, she would constantly whisper in Nero's ear, "I am your true wife," stroking his ego. And she finally got what she wanted. Octavia was exiled and killed. Nero officially declared Poppaea Empress. But the magnificent walls of the palace witnessed their quarrels as much as they did their love. Nero's fits of rage, jealousy, and erratic mood swings caused the relationship to turn toxic. Poppaea was the most powerful woman in Rome, living in the splendor of the palace. But in the shadow of that power, there was always death. According to accounts, in 65 AD, while she was pregnant, a beating she received during one of Nero's rages cost her and her unborn child their lives. This death was a major turning point for Nero, because Poppaea was not just an empress, she was his greatest obsession. Losing her created an unfillable void in Nero's mind. And that void was the beginning of Sporus's tragedy. The death of Poppaea Sabina had created a rift in Nero's mind. The Roman emperor was now a slave not only to power but also to his own passions. Poppaea was more than just a wife to him. She was an obsession. Her smile, her walk, her gaze, everything was etched into Nero's memory. Losing her had created an unbearable emptiness for the emperor. But Nero's obsessive personality would not allow him to accept this void. As historians tell it, the emperor became fixated on finding someone who looked exactly like Poppaea. Palace servants and advisors were sent all over Rome with a clear purpose: to find someone whose beauty resembled Poppaea's. And that's where Sporus entered the scene. Sporus was a young, slender boy. He was in the prime of his life. With his soft facial features, delicate skin, and graceful demeanor, he was different from other young men. Those who saw him noticed that his delicacy was reminiscent of Poppaea. Perhaps that's why Nero's eyes were locked on Sporus the first time he saw him. But Sporus's fate was sealed with that gaze, because Nero was determined to recreate the Poppaea he had lost in him. Rumors quickly spread through Rome. The emperor chose a young boy to resemble the empress. People whispered, unable to guess where this madness would lead. The selection of Sporus was not just a preference, but also a condemnation. From that moment on, he lost control over his own life. Nero's shadow fell upon him, and his identity and will began to be erased. Nero's orders were ruthless. Sporus had to become Poppaea. He would dress like her, adorn himself like her, and speak like her. In Rome's magnificent palace, there would now be a living Poppaea, but this time not as a woman, but as a young man. The selection of Sporus showed not only Nero's personal obsession, but also the decay in the mind of Rome's most powerful man. Unable to bring back his lost lover from death, an emperor had imprisoned a living youth in her shadow. The first step was brutal. Nero had Sporus forcibly castrated. This was not only a physical torture, but also the shattering of a soul. He was severed from his manhood, his youth, and his freedom. It is said that his screams echoed through the palace walls. From that moment on, he was dragged down a path of no return. But it didn't end there. Nero didn't just shape Sporus's body. He tried to rewrite his soul. He dressed him in women's clothes, fine silk dresses, gold-embroidered veils, Rome's most precious jewels. Sporus was now adorned with the splendor of an empress. His face was made up, his lips were colored, his eyes were accentuated. Now, when Sporus looked in the mirror, he didn't see his own face, but the ghost of a dead woman. When Sporus walked through the magnificent marble halls of the Roman palace, everyone whispered, because he was no longer Sporus. In Nero's mind, he was the reborn Poppaea Sabina. But behind this transformation was a great tragedy, because for Nero, it seemed like the rebirth of a love, but for Sporus, it was the slow murder of his own self. A young man's identity was taken from him, and he was trapped in a body against his will. His name was erased, and the name of a ghost was written in its place. Sporus was no longer an individual. He was a captive of an obsession, a living memory. In the magnificent marble halls of Rome, in front of a throne adorned with gold, a strange ceremony was held. Emperor Nero had summoned all the senators, commanders, and palace officials. Everyone was waiting with curiosity. What would the emperor do this time? And then the moment came. Sporus, wearing a pearl-embroidered wedding dress, was brought out before the crowd. On his head was a crown studded with precious stones, on his fingers golden rings, on his face a timid expression. But this was not a woman. This was a young man whom Nero had forcibly transformed. This woman is actually a man. The whispers began immediately. The emperor has gone mad. The sentences, echoing through the splendid walls of the palace, could only circulate as whispers, because no one dared to speak loudly. Nero's crazed gaze scanned the crowd. Everyone chose to remain silent, because to incur the emperor's wrath meant exile or death. In front of Rome's most powerful man, everyone's tongue was tied. When Sporus held Nero's hand, not a single sound came from the crowd.
No objection, no rebellion.
Just suppressed breaths, furtive glances, and an inner horror, because in the heart of Rome, the emperor's madness had become official. And in the face of that madness, even a great empire had to remain silent. The public watched Nero's marriage with both fear and curiosity. For some, this scene was proof of his madness. For others, it was just a display of the emperor's lust. But the truth was, Sporus had now lost his own identity and had become an emperor's ghost. The Roman throne does not remain the same for long. Nero's extravagant entertainments, absurd decisions, and cruelty finally exhausted the Senate's patience. Rebellions erupted. The army withdrew its support. The people, who had once greeted the emperor with applause, now cursed him. In the spring of 68 AD, Nero's world began to fall apart. As his throne slipped away, he was left with only a few servants. And among them was Sporus, who followed him like his shadow. The emperor was on the verge of collapse, but he couldn't dare to leave his fake Poppaea behind. The days they spent in hiding in a villa outside Rome turned into a frenzy that pushed the boundaries of sanity. Nero sometimes devised impossible escape scenarios and at other times staged his suicide like a theatrical performance. Sporus, in every moment, was like the tragic spouse playing his role beside a collapsing empire. Witnesses recount that Nero would embrace Sporus and whisper to him, "My one true love, my rebirth." He tried to persuade him to die with him, like a hero from an ancient tragedy. But time was running out. When the news came that his capture was imminent, Nero understood that death was inevitable. Yet even in his final moments, everything was like a theater stage. He asked Sporus to mourn him upon his death. When his hands trembled, as he pressed the dagger to his throat, only Sporus was by his side. The sharp path opened with Sporus's support was perhaps the only real moment of mercy in this twisted relationship. After Nero's death, Sporus's life did not get any easier. On the contrary, he fell into a darker captivity. He was no longer just a person but an object of political games and imperial intrigues. In the hands of Nymphidius Sabinus and later Otho and Vitellius, he was passed around like a piece of movable property. Each of them kept Sporus in feminine clothes, called him by Poppaea's name, and used him for their own pleasures and the amusement of the public. Under Vitellius's rule, Sporus's suffering reached its peak. The new emperor, decided to parade him before the public in the Colosseum. He was forced into humiliating and sexually explicit roles in shows reenacting mythological scenes. Before the eyes of thousands, he had to face the deepest form of shame and degradation he had endured for years. After years of humiliation and systematic abuse, Sporus, finally, found the opportunity to take control of his own life. Around 69 AD, likely just over 20 years old, he ended his life with poison. His death was, on one hand, a tragic loss, and on the other, the final act of liberation. His story is a striking example not only of physical and psychological abuse, but also of how imperial powers can annihilate a person's identity. The pain Sporus carried throughout his life and the systematic erasure of his identity make his story unforgettable. From the moment Nero chose him as a reflection of Poppaea, Sporus ceased to be an individual and became a tool for an emperor's twisted fantasies. His death was his final resistance against this imposed identity and humiliation. By his own choice, he reclaimed his life and honor. Perhaps the most tragic part is that almost nothing about Sporus's own life and desires was ever recorded. His hopes, dreams, and goals were erased by Nero's fantasies, replaced by a tragic performance. Sporus, who was forced to be an empress, suffered years of abuse, and ultimately gained his freedom through his own death, is not just a curiosity of Roman history. He deserves to be remembered as a symbol of survival and resistance against human cruelty. His story remains a painful life narrative that, behind the imperial splendor, should be remembered with attention and compassion even thousands of years later.